In the summer of 1976, at a school demolition sale outside of Waynesboro, Tennessee, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Acuff paid $47 for a pile of lumber that the Wayne County School Board had declared worthless. It was not a small pile. It was the salvaged framing from the east wing of the old Collinwood Grammar School, pulled down that spring to make room for a consolidated building the county had borrowed money to construct. 2x10s and 2x12s, most of them white oak, cut sometime in the early 1930s, when the school was built and air-dried in the walls for 40 years after that. There were also 4x4s, a quantity of 1x6 tongue-and-groove decking, and 3 rolls of corrugated tin roofing that had been stacked against the gymnasium wall and forgotten. The demolition crew had pulled the lumber out in sections, stacked it in the schoolyard, and the county had scheduled it for a bonfire until someone suggested a sale. The man running the sale looked at the stack and called it what it was: rough-cut used lumber of uncertain length, some nail holes, some checking on the ends, buyer to sort and haul. He opened it at $5 and waited. A man from Clifton bid $10. Nobody else moved. Lorene Acuff raised her hand and said $47. The man from Clifton looked at her. The auctioneer looked at her. He said going once, going twice, and that was that. Her brother-in-law, Dale Acuff, was standing beside her when she bid. He said, "Lorene, what in the world are you going to do with a pile of used school lumber?" She said she was going to build a barn. He said she didn't need a barn. She said she knew what she needed. The story traveled the way all stories travel, in small farming counties, from the sale to the feed store in Waynesboro, from the feed store to the co-op on Route 13, from the co-op to the lunch counter at Mabel's on the square, from Mabel's to the church parking lot after services the following Sunday. By the time it reached the church parking lot, it had acquired details it didn't start with. Some versions had her paying $100. Some versions had her hauling the lumber herself in a truck with a bad rear axle. Some versions had the lumber so rotten it crumbled when you touched it. None of those versions were accurate, but accuracy was not what the story was for. The story was for laughing at, and Wayne County laughed at it for the better part of that summer. They stopped laughing in the summer of 1988. Let me tell you about Lorene Acuff, because what she did with that lumber only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to see what she saw. Lorene Fay Acuff was born in 1945 on 160 acres outside of Waynesboro, Tennessee, in the southern end of Wayne County, where the land rolls up toward the Buffalo River watershed, and the soil is thin over limestone, but will grow fescue and orchard grass if you manage it right. Her father was Harlan Acuff, and Harlan Acuff was the kind of farmer who built everything himself. Not because he was poor, though money was never abundant, and not because he distrusted contractors, though he was skeptical of anyone who charged by the hour for work he could do himself. He built things himself because he understood that a building you built was a building you understood, and a building you understood was a building you could fix, and a building you could fix would outlast any building you simply paid for and forgot about. Harlan had built the farmhouse addition in 1949 using lumber. He milled from timber. He cleared from the east pasture. He built the equipment shed in 1952 using a combination of new lumber and salvage from a neighbor's collapsed corn crib. He built the hog house in 1957, the smokehouse in 1961, and a small workshop behind the equipment shed in 1963, using material he had accumulated over the previous decade in a habit so systematic it looked, to people who didn't understand it, like hoarding. It was not hoarding, it was inventory. There is a difference, and Harlan Acuff knew the difference, and he taught it to his daughter. The workshop was where Lorene learned to work, not in the way children learn things by watching. She learned by doing, starting around age 9 with a handsaw and a sawhorse, and a pile of scrap lumber Harlan kept for practice cuts, moving by her early teens to the framing square and the level and the chalk line, learning to read a board for crown and cup and twist before she cut it, learning to plan a structure from the ground up so that every piece of lumber in it was doing exactly the work it was designed to do, and nothing was wasted. Harlan did not teach her these things as lessons. He taught them as conversation. He would be framing a wall, and he would talk about what he was doing and why. And Lorene would listen and ask questions, and the questions were always the right questions, and Harlan noticed that. He also taught her to read a sale. Not an auction in the formal sense, though he attended those too, but any situation where something useful was available below its actual value because the person selling it didn't understand what they had. Harlan had a phrase for this. He said the price of ignorance runs in both directions. He meant that ignorance could make you pay too much for something worthless, or let you pay almost nothing for something valuable. He preferred to be on the right side of that equation. Lorene's mother had wanted her to go to Murfreesboro for college. There was a program at Middle Tennessee State, and Lorene had the grades for it, and her mother had a suitcase picked out, and an aunt in Murfreesboro who had a spare room. Lorene thought about it. She thought about it seriously enough that she wrote to the admissions office and received a catalog in return, and she read the catalog cover to cover sitting at the kitchen table on a February evening in 1963. Then she set the catalog down and went out to the workshop where her father was fitting a new handle on a splitting maul, and she watched him work for a while without saying anything, and eventually she went back inside and wrote a letter declining the program. She never fully explained why, not to her mother's satisfaction anyway, though years later she told her niece that she had looked at the catalog and looked at the farm and understood that the farm was where the knowledge was, and the knowledge was what she wanted. Harlan died in March of 1971 from a coronary that came without warning on a Wednesday morning while he was pulling fence posts in the south field. He was 63 years old. He left Lorene the farm, the equipment, the workshop, and everything in it, and a savings account at the First National Bank of Waynesboro that held $11,400, every cent of it accumulated without debt. There was no mortgage on the land. There had never been a mortgage on the land. Harlan had bought the farm in 1938. For cash money he had saved working at a sawmill for 6 years, and he had never borrowed against it. And he had told Lorene more than once that a paid-for farm was the only kind of farm worth having, because a paid-for farm was the only thing a bank could not take from you. Lorene was 26 years old when he died. She was the sole owner of 160 paid-for acres, with no mortgage, no equipment loans, and no partners. Her brothers offered to help. She thanked them and said she'd call if she needed anything. She didn't call. Now, the lumber. When Lorena Cuff looked at that pile of white oak framing in the Collinwood schoolyard in the summer of 1976, she did not see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw used lumber of uncertain length with nail holes and checked ends, good for a bonfire or a compost bin. Lorene saw 40-year-old air-dried white oak, which is one of the hardest and most dimensionally stable building materials available in Middle Tennessee, cut to full dimension 2-inch thickness at a time when modern dimensional lumber was already being sold undersized and available for approximately nothing because the people responsible for disposing of it did not know what they had. But here is what nobody at that sale understood, and what Dale Acuff did not understand when he asked her what she was going to do with it, and what the people at Mabel's lunch counter did not understand when they were laughing about it over coffee. Lorene had not decided to build a barn because she found the lumber. She had found the lumber because she had already decided to build the barn. She had been planning it for 14 months. The problem she was solving was forage storage. She was running a cow-calf operation on the back 60 acres, 30 head of Angus, and every winter she was buying hay from a broker out of Lawrenceburg who charged whatever the market would bear, which in a dry summer could be considerably more than in a wet one. In the winter of 1974, she had paid $3.20 a bale for 140 bales, which was money she could afford, but preferred not to spend. She had walked the farm that spring calculating what it would take to cut and store her own hay, and the answer came down to one thing: covered storage. Hay stored outside in Wayne County's weather was hay that rotted, and rotted hay was money that had already been spent twice. She needed a pole barn, something simple, 40 feet by 60 feet, open on one or two sides, with a tin roof and a concrete sill at the perimeter to keep the ground moisture out of the bottom bales. She had priced new lumber for such a structure at the hardware in Waynesboro and at the building supply in Collinwood. The framing alone, in new dimensional lumber at 1975 prices, was going to run somewhere between $400 and $500 before she bought tin or hardware or concrete. She had the money. That was not the issue. The issue was that Harlan Acuff's daughter did not pay $500 for something she could get for $47, and she was not going to start. She had heard about the Collinwood School demolition in the spring of 1976 from a man at the co-op who mentioned it in passing as something the county was doing. She had driven out to look at the building before the demolition crew arrived, walked around the east wing, looked at the framing where a window had been removed, and recognized the lumber for what it was. She had gone home and drawn the barn on graph paper at the kitchen table, calculated her lumber list, and determined that the school framing, if it ran to the quantity she estimated, would give her most of what she needed. She waited for the sale date. She showed up with $47 in her pocket and a specific number in her head, and when the auctioneer opened at $5, she let it run to $10, and then jumped it to $47 because she had done the arithmetic, and $47 was what the lumber was worth to her project, and she saw no reason to be coy about it. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Let me tell you about the build, because this is where Lorena Cuff proved something that Harlan would have recognized immediately, and that Wayne County was going to take 12 more years to understand. She hauled the lumber herself over 3 trips in the farm truck, stacking it by dimension in the equipment shed, and pulling nails as she went. straightening each nail on the anvil in the workshop the way Harlan had taught her, dropping the straight ones in a coffee can and the bent ones in a second can for later. She sorted the lumber by length and by condition, setting aside the pieces with significant checking and calculating what she could cut around. The 4x4s were in better shape than the 2x10s because they had been interior posts rather than exterior framing and had seen less moisture cycling. The tongue and groove decking was nearly perfect. She poured the perimeter sill herself over 2 weekends in late August, mixing concrete by hand in a half barrel, setting the forms from boards she ripped on the table saw in the workshop. The concrete cost her $11.40 in bags from the hardware. She set the anchor bolts herself, spacing them from a layout she had drawn on graph paper, and she let the concrete cure for 10 days before she touched it again. The poles were the one thing she bought new, because the salvage lumber did not include anything of sufficient diameter for the corner and intermediate posts in a 40x60 structure. She bought 12 pressure-treated 6x6s from the building supply in Collinwood, 8-footers, and had them delivered for a total of $63, including freight. She set them herself with a post hole digger and a level, checking plumb on 2 faces for each post, tamping the backfill in 6-inch lifts, the way Harlan had done it, which took longer than most people would have patience for, but produced a post that did not move. The framing went up over 4 weekends in September and October of 1976, Lorene working alone on most of it and calling her nephew Robert on 2 Saturdays when she needed a second pair of hands to lift the ridge beam. The white oak was heavy, heavier than green pine would have been, but it did not flex and it did not bow, and when she nailed it, the nails went in clean and stayed. She used the straightened salvage nails for the secondary framing and bought new 16-penny sinkers for the structural connections, $22 for a 50-pound box. The tin roofing from the school sale covered 2/3 of the roof. She bought 1 additional roll of corrugated tin from a farm supply in Waynesboro to finish the south slope, $14. When it was done, she walked around it twice and then went inside and made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger she kept for the farm. Concrete and forms, $11.40. Pressure-treated posts, $63. New nails, $22. Additional tin, $14. Hardware, hinges, and miscellaneous, $9 and change. The lumber and original tin from the school sale, $47. Total, $166 and some cents, which she rounded to $170 in the ledger to account for anything she had forgotten. A 40x60 pole barn with a tin roof and a poured perimeter sill, built from white oak framing that would outlast anything the building supply in Collinwood had on the lot, for $170. A contractor in Waynesboro would have charged her somewhere between $2,200 and $2,800 for the same structure and new materials. She had billed it for $170. The difference, roughly $2,400, went into the savings account at First National, which by the fall of 1976 held just over $19,000, every cent of it unencumbered. She cut her first hay crop off the back meadow. The following June, a stand of orchard grass and red clover she had overseeded the previous fall, and she put up 210 bales in the new barn over 3 cuttings. The bales were stacked on wooden pallets she had salvaged from behind the co-op, 4 inches off the concrete. with 18 inches of clearance at the eaves for airflow. She covered the top of the stack with a tarp she already owned. Not one bale rotted. She did not buy hay that winter for the first time in 6 years. Her neighbor to the east, a man named Curtis Blevins, who ran a similar cow-calf operation on adjacent land, stopped by the barn that November to look at it. Curtis had been farming Wayne County for 30 years and considered himself a fair judge of construction. He walked around the outside once, ducked under the eaves on the open south side, looked at the framing, looked at the posts, looked at the way the tin was lapped and screwed. He took his cap off and ran his hand over the back of his neck. He said, "What did you use for framing?" She said, "White oak out of the old Collinwood school." He said, "The lumber from that sale last summer." She said, "Yes." He said Harlan would have done the same thing. She said she knew. Curtis Blevins was not a man who complimented construction lightly, and he did not say anything else, but the way he put his cap back on and looked at the barn one more time before he walked back to his truck said what? He did not put into words. Word spread differently after that, not the laughing kind of word, but the kind that farmers pass to other farmers when they have seen something with their own eyes that they cannot quite explain away. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years, watched them laugh at the purchase and miss the plan and only come around when the evidence was impossible to ignore, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one is not over yet. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 12 years, because this is where the story stops being about a barn and starts being about something else entirely. Lorene Acuff farmed her 160 acres through the late 1970s and into the 1980s the same way she had always farmed them, which is to say, carefully, without debt, and with a ledger she updated every Friday evening at the kitchen table. She expanded the cow herd from 30 head to 42 by 1979, selling calves in the fall and keeping replacement heifers she selected herself. She put up hay every summer, 3 cuttings most years, and by 1981 she was storing between 350 and 420 bales annually in the pole barn, which held the weight without complaint, and showed no movement in the posts, and no rust on the tin beyond surface oxidation that did not penetrate. She added a second structure in 1980, a smaller equipment lean-to off the east wall of the original barn, built from new lumber this time because she had not found a suitable salvage source and did not intend to wait, and the lean-to cost her $240 in materials, including a concrete apron she poured herself. She paid cash. She always paid cash. The savings account at First National grew steadily through this period, not dramatically, but with the kind of consistency that comes from an operation that produces more than it spends every single year without exception. The county around her was doing something different. Through the mid-1970s and into the early 1980s, the prevailing logic in Wayne County and in most of rural Tennessee was that land values would keep rising, commodity prices would stay strong, and borrowed money was the mechanism by which a serious farmer expanded a serious operation. The operating loan was not considered a warning sign. It was considered evidence of ambition. Men who were not borrowing were men who were not growing, and men who were not growing were men who were falling behind, and falling behind in a farming county was a social condition as much as a financial one. Lorene Acuff was not borrowing. She was not growing in the way the county measured growth. She was deepening, which is a different thing, and the county did not have a word for it that was complimentary. Then 1988 arrived. You know what happened in the summer of 1988. The drought that year was the worst across the Mid-South since the 1950s, and in Wayne County, it was severe enough to cut hay yields by more than half across most operations by the second cutting. The first cutting came in light. The second cutting for many farms did not come in at all. Pastures that were green in May were brown and cracked by July, and the cattle that needed hay in the winter were standing in fields that had stopped producing it in midsummer. The hay brokers understood supply and demand as well as anyone. The broker out of Lawrenceburg, who had been selling hay in Wayne County for years, was charging $3.20 a bale in the winter of 1974, when Lorene had done her original calculation. By August of 1988, he was charging $9 a bale, and he was not apologetic about it because he did not have to be. There was more demand than supply, and he had the supply, and that was the arithmetic of a drought year. $9 a bale is a number that sounds manageable until you calculate what it costs to carry a cow herd through a Tennessee winter. A cow in that climate needs roughly a bale and a half per day in winter feeding conditions, more if the weather is hard, and a 40-cow operation running from November through March is consuming somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 bales depending on the winter. At $9 a bale, that is between $16,000 and $20,000 in hay alone, before you have paid for anything else, before you have serviced any debt, before you have bought a single bag of mineral supplement or a single roll of fence wire. Farms in Wayne County that were carrying operating loans and equipment loans and land loans discovered in the summer of 1988 that there was no combination of numbers that worked. Curtis Blevins, who farmed to Lorene's east, and who had looked at her barn in November of 1976 and said Harlan would have done the same thing, was carrying a note on a tractor he had bought in 1983 and a line of credit at the Farm Credit Office in Waynesboro that he had drawn against for operating expenses in 2 of the previous 4 years. The drought did not ruin Curtis Blevins, but it cost him a winter of sleep and a significant portion of a calf crop he sold early at poor prices to reduce his hay requirement. He was not alone. 3 farms in the southern end of the county changed hands between 1988 and 1990. Not all of them because of the drought alone, but the drought was the thing that made the underlying arithmetic impossible to ignore. Lorene Acuff's expenses in the summer and fall of 1988 did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had 410 bales in the pole barn when the drought settled in, the product of a first cutting that had come in before the rains stopped, and she had enough to carry her herd through the winter, with a margin she calculated at approximately 60 bales. She did not buy hay at $9 a bale. She did not need to. The barn she had built for $170 in the fall of 1976 was doing in 1988 exactly what she had built it to do in 1976, which was to make her independent of the hay broker and the weather and the arithmetic of other people's emergencies. She watched what was happening in the county that fall not with satisfaction, because she had neighbors she respected, and the drought was genuinely hard on people who did not deserve hard. but with the particular quiet that comes from having thought through a problem years before it arrived, and having built the answer out of 40-year-old white oak and salvaged tin for less than the cost of a good winter coat. In October of 1989, a farm of 83 acres on the north side of the county road that ran along Lorene's western boundary came up for auction. The family that had owned it, the Holloways, had been farming it for 2 generations, but the combination of the drought year, an equipment loan from 1985, and a land note they had refinanced at the wrong moment had produced a situation the Farm Credit Office in Waynesboro was no longer willing to extend. The auction was set for a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, and the opening bid was set at $420 per acre, which was below what the land had been worth in 1982, but above what several people in the county thought it would bring in the current climate. Lorene Acuff drove to that auction in the farm truck and stood near the back of the crowd with her hands in her jacket pockets. There were speculators from Nashville, 2 of them, and a land investment group from Columbia that had been buying distressed farm ground across Middle Tennessee for 18 months. There were also several local farmers who were curious but not capitalized, people who would have liked to buy the land but did not have the means to do it cleanly. The bidding opened at $420 an acre and moved in increments. The Nashville speculators were active early. The Columbia group came in around $500. Lorene waited until the field had thinned to 3 bidders, and then she raised her hand at $540 per acre and held it there while the other bidders looked at each other and recalculated. The Columbia group dropped out at $560. One of the Nashville speculators stayed until $580 and then shook his head. Lorene Acuff bought 83 acres of Wayne County bottomland for $580 per acre. Total consideration, $48,140, which she paid by check drawn on the First National Bank of Waynesboro, where her account had been accumulating, without debt and without interruption, since 1971. The crowd at that auction went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a room full of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about a woman they had been underestimating for 13 years. Not all of them had laughed at the school lumber purchase in 1976, but all of them had known about it, and all of them had formed an opinion. And the opinion they had formed was being revised in real time on a Tuesday morning in October, while Lorene put the checkbook back in her jacket pocket and shook hands with the auctioneer. Dale Acuff, her brother-in-law, was in the back of that crowd. He had been there since the bidding opened. He found her after the sale was concluded, standing by the truck, and he stood next to her for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Lorene, I owe you an apology about that lumber." She said, "Dale, you don't owe me anything." He said, "I said you didn't need a barn." She said, "I know what you said." He said, "I was wrong about that." She said she knew that too. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Harlan Acuff would have understood without a word of explanation. Lorene farmed the combined 243 acres through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, expanding the cow herd to 60 head on the additional pasture and cutting hay off the new bottomland, which produced heavier yields than the original ground because the soil was deeper and held moisture better. She built a second pole barn on the new property in 1992, using a combination of new lumber and salvage from a dairy operation that had liquidated in Giles County, and the second barn cost her $290 in materials, which she noted in the ledger without comment. The original barn, the one she had built in the fall of 1976 from the Collinwood School lumber, for $170, was still standing. The posts had not moved. The tin had not failed. The white oak framing, which had been air drying for 40 years before she bought it, and had now been in service for another 25, was harder than it had been the day she nailed it, because white oak continues to cure under load, and the load she had put on it was exactly what the framing was designed to carry. Her niece, Robert's daughter, a girl named Cassie, who was 15 in the late 1990s and spent summers on the farm, learned to use the framing square in Harlan's workshop the same way Lorene had learned it, by doing it while someone who knew how watched and talked about what they were seeing. Lorene taught her to read a board for crown and cup and twist. She taught her to plan a structure from the ground up so that nothing was wasted. She showed her the coffee can of straightened nails on the workbench and explained where they had come from and why they were there. Cassie asked her once why she kept straightened nails when she could afford to buy new ones. Lorene thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "It's not about the nails," Cassie said. "What's it about then?" Lorene said, "It's about knowing the difference between what something costs and what it's worth." Cassie wrote that down in a notebook she kept that summer, and years later, she framed it and hung it in her own workshop in a different county, above a workbench she had built herself from salvaged lumber. In 2001, Lorene was invited to speak at a Wayne County Farm Bureau meeting in Waynesboro, one of those annual gatherings where the agenda is part business and part community. And someone had thought it would be useful to have her say something about farm financial management, given what had happened in the county over the previous decade and a half. She was 56 years old. She stood up at the front of the room and looked at the people she had been farming alongside for 30 years. And she said approximately the following. She said, "People ask me how I got through the 80s and the drought and all of it without losing ground. And the answer is I didn't do anything special. I just didn't borrow money to pay for things I could build myself. And I didn't buy things I couldn't pay for outright. And I stored hay in a barn I built for $170, so I didn't have to buy it at $9 a bale when everybody else needed it at the same time." She paused. She said, "A paid-for barn and a paid-for farm are the only things a bank can't take from you. Everything else is just borrowing time." De La Cuff was in that room. He did not say anything, but he nodded slowly, in the way of a man who has had 13 years to think about a conversation he wishes he had handled differently. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a pile of used lumber at a school demolition sale? Most people see scrap. They see nail holes and checked ends and the inconvenience of sorting and hauling. They see something the county has already decided is worthless. Lorene Acuff saw 40-year-old air-dried white oak, available for $47. She saw the framing of a barn she had been planning for 14 months. She saw 400 bales of hay stored dry through a drought year, while the broker charged $9 a bale to everyone who had not planned ahead. She saw 83 acres of bottomland bought with cash at a Tuesday morning auction, while a crowd of people went quiet and rearranged everything they thought they knew. Everyone else saw scrap lumber. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds. $47. A schoolyard in Collinwood. a woman with a framing square and a graph paper plan and her father's coffee can of straightened nails. The barn nobody wanted, built by the woman nobody understood, until the summer the hay broker charged $9 a bale, and she already had 400 bales in a structure that had cost her less than the first month's interest on the loans that broke her neighbors.